We've driven the iCaur V23 before, the all-wheel drive model, and we remarked on the fact that it's such a capable car both on and off-road that it makes a great car to have all the way round. So what happens then when you take one motor away and add about 20,000 ringgits worth of accessories to it? Actually, it's not just one motor they removed, they've also taken away the bigger battery. Because the iCaur V23 all-wheel drive utilizes an 80 plus kilowatt hour NMC battery, which gives this car an effective range of about 420 kilometers on a full charge. On this two-wheel drive model, there is a single motor mounted over the rear wheels, which produces no less than 136 PS and 180 Newton meters of torque. It is powered by a 59 kilowatt-hour LFP battery, which gives this car an effective range of about 350 kilometers on a single charge. In terms of charging, this car can accept up to 85 kilowatt DC, allowing this car to go from 10 to 80% in about 30-ish minutes, 35 minutes thereabouts, whereas AC charging is capped at just 6.6 kilowatts, which means that a dead to full charge on this will take about 10 hours. But of course, that smaller battery and reduced range does not take away from the iCaur V23's appeal, which is no doubt anchored in its looks. Now, talking about that specifically, this car has the Retro Pack Edition, or Retro Pack on it, which is why up front we get a slightly different grille here with a mesh pattern in order to make it look like a slightly more retro off-roader. We also have this incredibly interesting wrap scheme to it, where we have this green here, lots of chrome on the over fenders and the bumpers, which actually extends all the way to the rear, by the way. You also get that roof rack done up in chrome and solid wood, which also continues down onto the fenders, and even the chrome and solid wood side steps. All of this is part of the Retro Pack, which costs an additional 18,888 ringgit and is available for a limited time. At time of filming, they're still available. By the time you're watching this, maybe not. But this being the two-wheel drive, there are no other visual differences on the outside. You still get full LED headlights, replete with automatic high beam, LED indicators up here, nice big bash plates, and lots of little bits and pieces like here and over there where the sensors live, the millimeter wave radars, in order to give this car proper level 2 semi-autonomy. Underneath this bonnet, I have no idea what's going on because you can't open this, which means that there is no frunk, but that also means that I don't know what they've put in there, especially given the fact that this is a rear-wheel drive model, which to me would imply there's a lot of space in here, but I guess we'll never know. Down the side, this car rides on its standard wheels, which are 19-inch alloys wrapped in Chaoyang tires. Now, although I prefer the all-wheel drive in terms of the range and the performance, I actually prefer the wheels on this two-wheel drive model, which look like your typical old Steelies, which I think is much more fitting with this car's retro off-roader vibe. Moving further down, this is the solid wood fender panel that I mentioned earlier, and those solid wood side steps that I mentioned, and more solid wood up there as part of the roof rack. Now, the wrap, I think, is no doubt the most interesting part of this view, where as you can see, you have green here offset by a little bit of off-white here and off-white on the roof, as well as this bright orange bit here, which I think does make this car look and stand out significantly more than the V23 already does. And as a result, it has split opinion somewhat. I'm of the opinion that you don't really need your V23 to look like this because it's already a very funky looking machine. But I suppose if you really want to stand out, there is an option. Now, one thing that you won't be able to see from this angle is the ladder. The ladder is actually on the other side of the car. Now, that ladder appears at first glance to have a panel that is screwed into this fender here in order to ensure that it's solid enough for you to climb up on. However, what I found out is that actually it's only screwed into the top onto that roof bar, because the bit that's affixed here, even though it has nuts, is actually held in place by magnets. I know this because I put my whole weight on it and it moved, which scared me a lot. Now, aside from that, the side profile of the V23, like I said, looks very much like an old school off-roader, and I love the way this car looks, even though there is a massive blind spot as a result of it not offering any sort of window opening here. But sod it, it looks cool. Now, the back of the V23 also looks very much like an old school off-roader with very small full LED tail lights here, where millimeter wave radars live in here, and that wrap also extends to a nice big chrome bumper at the rear, which reminds me of 50s sports cars if you can look all the way back there. You also have this faux spare tire cover box thing here, which does nothing from the outside. But from the inside, it does offer a little bit of extra space for you to hide things like an emergency tire repair kit, for example, which I think is quite interesting. Now, because of the design of this tailgate, it doesn't actually swing upwards, instead it swings to the side, which means that much like the iCaur V23, the other one, it means that you will need some additional clearance back here in order to open this swing door all the way. Although that said, even when I reverse this up to a wall, I did find that that's about enough space that you need in order to fit a cabin-side suitcase in the back. So maybe it's not that bad. Now, once you do open this tailgate, you will find that there isn't that much space, and that's because the V23 is actually quite a compact car. It's only a little bit bigger than what you get from, say, an HRV, and not nearly as large as a CRV. And that becomes very obvious back here, because as you can see, with the load floor set to its flat setting or its higher setting, there isn't really all that much room back here, although you can fold the rear seats 50-50, and they do fold completely flat. However, you can remove this and actually set it to a lower setting, but I can't be bothered. And at that point, this is actually tall enough for you to fit in proper luggage size bags upright, which means that if you do need to maximize space, you can do that. And even if you were to put this load floor at its lower setting, there is still enough space down there for you to hide smaller items, things like a emergency triangle. But I'd rather you put them here in that box that I mentioned. See? Space. Which I think is quite interesting. Aside from that, back here, there is nothing else. There is a hook, there are some netting there's some netting here, and that's it. There isn't even a power socket back here, which means that if you do want to camp in the back of your V23, you're going to have to get a little bit more creative, I suspect. Now, if you've watched our earlier content of the iCaur V23 all-wheel drive, you will notice something missing, and that is the instrument cluster that used to live here. That's because that's actually an optional item, which was being packaged together with the car for early bird customers, but I suspect it has since been discontinued, or it's simply not available on the two-wheel drive model. Nonetheless, everything else in here is exactly as you'd expect. So you have this massive central screen here, which controls the majority of this car's functions. That includes things like your driving mode, your off-road settings, as well as your visibility for your controls and so on, all live here. And because there is no instrument cluster, that means all of your instrumentation lives on this part of the screen here. However, this screen is pretty useful because you do have a myriad of apps to use with it. And you also have an around view monitor, a 360-degree camera, which is absolutely fantastic. As you can see, the resolution is absolutely fabulous, and more importantly, it is very responsive. In fact, if you put this in 3D mode, you can see just how quickly this system is able to render this car from any possible angle, which is always nice to see. In addition to that, you also have the option of being able to upload your file management, which means that, for example, you can actually watch videos in the car using this massive screen, which is nice to have, I suppose, for an adventure car like this, where you might be going on, camping trips and stuff like that. It's nice to be able to use this screen for your own entertainment. This is all very good because, as you can see, in addition to this, there is no other screen in here. So I'm glad that this does that, although this would have been a lot better if this was electrochromatic. Instead, it's just a manual affair. But again, this is 119,000 ringgit. It's not the most expensive car in the world, so I suppose it is pretty much all right. Despite that relatively affordable price tag, material quality in here is all pretty good. Lots of soft touch materials about the place in all your major touch points, and you have lots of tactile buttons and switches and knobs, which are really nice and satisfying to use, and allows you to change certain settings on this car without really having to take your eye off the road. More importantly, you get toggle switches down here for all of your major functions, and you even get more toggle switches up here to turn on, for example, the dome light, or even to add a couple of accessories via the auxiliary switches that live up here on the ceiling, and they work with a lovely tactile function to them, which means that, once again, it is just nice to use all of the features in here. It feels nice to use. The same goes for the steering wheel, where, as you can see, we have a couple of sort of unmarked buttons on either side, but these buttons themselves feel metallic, which means that when you use them, it just feels high quality. Despite the fact this is a relatively small car, again, quality seems to be the name of the game here. These two front seats, for example, are powered with ventilation. You get an NFC reader here, no wireless charging pad, unfortunately, but you do get a bunch of USB-C ports in this center console, as well as a single USB-A port for you to add, say, a thumb drive in order to use this car's built-in drive recorder system. You also get a couple of cup holders here with a adjustable cup size, and you can actually remove the whole thing to have further access to an even deeper well in there. That's particularly good given the fact this car does not come with a glove box, and the door cards are very thin, which means if you do want to put a bottle or something in there, you'll have to actually stretch it out in order to put something inside. So the fact that this area is quite commodious is probably for the better. The other thing that I'd like to point out is the fact that the floor in this car is actually completely flat, which means that as I'm sat here, I can actually stretch my leg all the way into the passenger side, which I know sounds very strange. But if you're trying to get out on the other side of the car for whatever reason, at least access is a little bit easier here, which I think is nifty and neat. And because quality is so good, nothing in here squeaks, nothing in here rattles, everything feels nice and solid. Even the steering wheel, which only adjusts, unfortunately, for angle and not for reach. But overall, it just feels alright, it's nice. And unlike what you get in a Jeep Wrangler, a car I'm quite familiar with, your switches for your windows and your mirrors don't live in the middle. Instead, they live up here, where you'd expect them to, just like you would find on a Land Rover. And so as far as I'm concerned, I think that this interior is pretty much alright. If I wanted to have a couple of grouses, firstly, I'd like an instrument cluster. Secondly, the fact that we still have manual leveling for the headlights via this toggle switch here feels a bit sort of naff. I don't understand why it is that even expensive Chinese cars still have manual headlight leveling. And the last moan I'd like to have about this interior is the same moan that I had about the V23 all-wheel drive, and that's the fact that the sound system in this car is really not that great. I have seen several V23 owners online complain about the sound system, and they've identified a few stores around the Klang Valley especially that are able to upgrade some of the hardware in this car in order to make the sound a little bit more bearable, but as standard it is very much a mixed bag and generally not that enjoyable, which is quite unfortunate because I imagine this would be a great town car otherwise, and I'm not going to drive about in town if I can't listen to my music. In the back of the iCaur V23, life is also pretty good. With the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a generous amount of knee room, right? A pretty good amount of headroom thanks to this car's very square and boxy body. And although these seats appear to only fit 2 people, actually this car is designed for 3 because there is actually a centrally mounted third belt for a central passenger, although really I wouldn't recommend it. Because while the floor is completely flat, so there's plenty of space for feet, this central bit is quite raised, and more importantly, you have a seam running through it, which means a middle passenger is not going to be comfortable at all. However, 2 outer passengers should be very comfortable indeed, because as I'm sat here, I've got very good under thigh support. The side bolstering is quite significant. I've got a great view out, a nice place to rest my arm here. All the materials feel nice and good, although I do not have a cup holder anywhere. And thankfully, this car is quite small because there are no rear air conditioning vents, which means that I'm relying on the 3 centrally mounted air conditioning vents up front in order to keep the back half of the cabin cool. I also don't have any USB ports, so thankfully the ones that are mounted in the center console should be decently accessible for rear passengers. I do have netting behind the front seats and more netting down here on the door, but otherwise, in terms of overall amenities, there are quite few back here. There are at least ISOFIX mounts, which should be relatively easy to locate, and these seat bases can actually be raised in order to accommodate more items down here should you want them, but more importantly, it should also mean that you can fold these rear seats completely flat should you need to maximize cargo space in your V23. Now, with all of that said, I do think the V23 does make a pretty good case for itself as an urban city runabout, because I do think that this very tall, commanding drive position, the very smooth electric powertrain, as well as the bits and pieces of specification in here which make this car very livable day to day, do seem to make it like something that you want to drive every day, especially in town, especially given that range. But with only 180 Newton meters, how slow is this thing? Now, driving the iCaur V23, there are a couple of things that you need to know about this 2-wheel drive model. Firstly, with a full charge, you have an effective range of about 340 kilometers. Although if you drive about in town, I think you can eke it out to about 370 if you're careful. Secondly, 180 Newton meters of torque doesn't sound like a lot because it isn't. But the reality is that when you drive about in a car like this, especially if you're just driving about in town, you don't really need all that much torque. You just need about enough for you to be able to merge convincingly with traffic, and that's about it. And in terms of doing that, this car is perfectly acceptable. In fact, the iCaur V23 to me feels like one of the most complete packages in terms of what a town car needs to be, because as I'm sat here, I have great visibility all the way around. The ADAS functions are already screaming at me. And because this car is actually not as large as its visuals might suggest, it means that when you are just driving about in town, it is actually relatively easy to place this car on the road, and it's quite easy to park, believe it or not. No doubt as a result, or rather no doubt with the assistance of this car's 360-degree camera. The other thing that makes this car quite an adept town car is actually the controls. So the steering, for example, in this car is surprisingly light, although even if you set it to sport like I have now, it still doesn't feel all that heavy. And as a result, again, it is quite easy for you to just maneuver this car about town, to cut in and out of traffic, or to do a three-point turn if you need to make a sudden U-turn or something like that. It's just easy to use. And things like the signal stalks, as well as the gear selector stalk up here on the column, just means that, again, everything just falls very easily to hand. It's very easy for you to control the car, maneuver the car through tighter situations and stuff. It just makes life easy. Just really, really easy. Now, of course, you could argue the fact that the iCaur V23 at 120,000 ringgit might not necessarily be the most comfortable car in the world to drive around in, and you'd be right. That's because as a result of this being a roughy, tufty off-roader, naturally the suspension is a little bit on the stiffer side, which means that if you are driving about, say, on the rutted surfaces of PJ, you will find yourself bouncing around a little bit, but it's honestly not that bad. And furthermore, when you're driving at lower speeds, this car does manage to deal with road imperfections pretty well. It's only at higher speeds that the sort of repetitive motions and the general vibrations sort of get into the cabin and sort of stir things up a little bit. But honestly, it isn't bad in the slightest. I wouldn't call this car uncomfortable at all. In fact, as a town car, this car is great. I love it. However, given the fact this is the model with the smaller battery and therefore the shorter range, you might also think that this car might not be that great on the open road, particularly given the fact that when I drove the long-range big battery model, even that car struggled to do about 350 kilometers on a single charge, let alone the 440 that it actually claims. And once again, you'd be right, because this car does not like open roads. This car likes urban settings. It likes stop-start, slow-moving traffic, because that sort of thing allows it to be the most efficient that it can be. Because once speeds pick up, especially on open roads, and you're trying to sustain higher speed over a longer period of time, that's when you realize that this car's very blocky appearance does not do it any favors in terms of its aerodynamic profile. So what that means is, as speeds start to pick up north of, say, 90 kilometers an hour, that's when wind noise starts to make itself rather apparent, not just from the very bluff windscreen, but also from the rather chunky door mirrors. In addition to that, you also have to deal with a considerable amount of road noise. Not terrible, but there is some, and that's worth bearing in mind given the fact that this is ultimately an EV. And because the sound system in this car is not necessarily the best thing in the world, it also means that you can't really rely on it to drown out the majority of the sounds as you might want it to do. Which means that ultimately, as you drive about in this car, the moment speeds pick up, like I said, everything sort of falls off a cliff. But it's not bad in any way, because ultimately there is no vehicle that is built like this, to look like this, with these sort of proportions, that are going to do any better. As someone who used to drive around in a V6 Wrangler, I can tell you that even that, with that massive powertrain, didn't really like going above 110 kilometers an hour, and that car was noisier than this, but it did have a better sound system from Alpine. But anyway, when you put all of that together, you have to consider the fact that this is ultimately designed to be this sort of urban adventurer kind of thing, and so some compromises are going to be required. For example, looking out and trying to change lanes, for example, might be a little bit more challenging in this as a result of this car's over fenders, which might not necessarily be something that most people are familiar with or can get used to, particularly given the fact that most cars, obviously, don't have them. But that is a relatively small matter. The over-the-shoulder view, because this car has very, very chunky C-pillars, does mean that that's a little bit compromised. But again, it's not anything that you can't get used to over time. At no point driving this car have I encountered an issue so great that it would write it off. It is just relatively minor niggles at the end of the day. And in exchange for overlooking or glossing past those minor niggles, you get a car that is just fantastic. I love this thing. I think that it looks great, it's very well specified, and because this car comes with full level 2 semi-autonomy, it means that it does a really good job at being a city car, because in traffic jams, for example, it drives itself. It has AEB, blind spot monitoring, red cross traffic alert, lane departure warning, which you've heard go off a couple of times, lane centering. It's got basically the full gamut of active safety features that you'd expect from a modern car, let alone one that is not that expensive and offers this much character as standard. Now, actually, talking about the touch and go, because I'm coming up to a toll plaza, normally I actually cut the cameras here for a minute because I have to open the window, but just look at how easy it is for me to use this touch and go. I don't need one of those stupid extender thingies. See? Easy. And that, to me, just adds to the appeal of the iCaur V23. This car just looks like nothing else on the road. It turns heads like nothing else on the road. And of course, in this particular car with its retro pack, it gets even better still, if that's the sort of thing you're into. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm hard-pressed to think of a genuine reason why this might not necessarily be your thing. Sure, if you want something that is a little bit more practical in terms of carrying people in the back as well as luggage in the rear, then perhaps the iCaur O3 might be a bit more interesting. Or if you really, really need space, then of course there is the Proton EMA 7, which also offers more range in addition to that because it looks like a jelly bean. But if you want something with a little bit of character, and if you don't want a car that you can lose in the corporate car park, then the iCaur V23 is pretty good. Although that said, at the time of filming, the iCaur V23 in the month of March managed to outsell the Tesla Model 3, which means that it might not be that long before you start seeing more and more of these proliferate their way into town. So if you want to stand out, do it now. And this might be the time for you to get this retro pack fitted as well. But in any case, that concludes our review of the 2026 iCaur V23 Rear-Wheel Drive Retro Edition. That's the phrase. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.